Welcome back. I am Ahmed Shawqi, and this is a conversation I have been looking for a while. My guest is Professor Ioannis Ioannou. Is that correct,
Excellent.
Professor?
Excellent.
Ioannis is a London Business School professor of strategy and entrepreneurship. If you work anywhere near sustainability strategy and corporate leadership, you have almost certainly read him. His research sits in the Strategy Management Journal, Management Science, and the Academy of Management Review, where he is also an associate editor. He writes for the Financial Times, Forbes, and Project Syndicate. Ioannis is also co-chairs the Sustainability Advisor panel at Merck. He sits on the ESG Advisory Board at DWS. And his online course on sustainability leadership has taken more than 1,000 senior leaders and board members through it. It won the Financial Times Responsible Business Education Award. Congrats, Ioannis.
Thank you.
Ioannis is also a LinkedIn top voice, and Ioannis is also a strategic advisor to SustainGRC. I'm honored to have you with us. These days, he writes under a theme or a banner he calls Aligned Capitalism, and we will learn more about that today. Ioannis, welcome. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. I was looking forward to this conversation as well. So, and there's so many topics we have for today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really, there is a lot to discuss in 30 minutes, so I'll try to keep it concise and relevant to the audience at this stage. And later in the year, we might need to have an extension of this session. But let's dive right in. My first question to you is about the new economic logic for sustainability. You shared the LSEG numbers that green economy now passed the $10 trillion, effectively the third largest industry in the world. You said it's now pulled by economics, not just pushed by policy. And in the same month, you quoted the Financial Times that the market rewards Exxon for making the problem harder to solve. How are both true?
Yeah, well, that, Ahmed, in a nutshell, kind of highlights the schizophrenia of the system, right? In which we certainly see within the current system pockets of progress. So, for instance, you mentioned the green economy, and within that, you can think about sectors like energy, for instance, like transportation and electric vehicles. So, certainly, there have been policies and industries that have propelled us forward in the sense of decarbonizing, electrifying the economy much more, and ultimately getting these technologies like renewables, for instance, to a point where they are economically more competitive than, in this case, fossil fuels. However, we could also take a step back and see, well, both companies, both sectors, right? They function within a capitalist system, and many times it feels that they are functioning within a system that was designed against them. Right? Because the traditional system that we have in many ways assumes, for instance, infinite growth. It works within a context where several resources have not been properly priced, and therefore they're being used for free, and therefore they're being abused, overused, or wasted. And as a result, as scientists have told us, we're now functioning outside what would be considered the ecological ceiling. In other words, outside the system that can actually sustain us. Therefore, going back to the first point that you made about the business case, for many years we've been asking, is sustainability profitable? And for an initial stage, I think that was a very good question to ask, because ultimately we're not talking about building sustainable companies that are inferior companies. Quite the opposite. We're talking about building sustainable companies that are better companies, both in the competitive sense as well as the impact sense. However, those companies function within a system. So if that system works against them, naturally they will hit a wall or reach a ceiling. So, for instance, if renewables are doing very well, but then the world is providing direct or indirect subsidies to the tune of trillions of dollars a year to the fossil fuel industry, then clearly the game is kind of rigged against renewables. So when we talk about the business case in that sense, I think in this sort of rethought way about the business case is not asking only is sustainability profitable, but elevating that question and asking what changes do we need to make into the system such that sustainable business is the only profitable business, which is another way of basically saying, simplify it, but rather saying, well, how are companies that cause harm to society and the environment going to pay for the harm that they're causing, right? So the previous question was about, in some ways, coming up with the business models, the organizational structures to make sustainability competitive, and we made significant progress on that. The second component is how do we elevate that to the system level so that the economy that we're building functions within ecological ceilings and builds a sufficiently robust social foundation.
Amazing. Sustainable business is the only profitable business. And speaking of the system level and to your theme, your current theme about aligned capitalism, you have called for a system where ecological cost now is priced into markets before anyone acts sustainably. So most leaders don't have the system yet. I don't know if you have seen any. And they are operating inside the one you just described as broken. So what does aligned capitalism ask of them right now, and what does it mean also for those who don't understand that again in other words?
Well, in some ways, the system is not broken in the sense that it works exactly as designed in a linear economy, in an economy based on extraction and waste, and an economy that focuses on growth and completely ignores the limited resources that we have. So in that way, the system is not broken. It's just that it's a misfit for the planet that we are on and the societies that we live in. But within the system, I do think that there are companies, and increasingly more companies, that realize that, first of all, on the current path, we're not going to have an orderly transition. In other words, we're not going to transition into a fully decarbonized economy, an economy that functions within the limits in an orderly way, meaning laws, regulations, policies, business models, mind frames, and so on. But rather, we are on a path whereby the transition feels disorderly, crisis driven. Think about what's happening in the UK now. We're going through the heat wave. The Met Office is confirming that this is not a one off. You should forget the weather and the climate that we used to have in the past. And suddenly we realize, oh, wait a second, our entire infrastructure is not up to speed, whether you want to talk about schools, hospitals, elderly homes, residential properties, and everything in between. And suddenly you have, literally, I was reading this week, you have hospital operations being cancelled because of the heat. You have estimates about literally thousands of people dying in this heat wave. Okay. And then you realize that, wait a second, infrastructure cannot be built overnight. You need to plan for it. Well, no kidding. Right. But if you don't plan for it, then you end up being in this crisis driven, short-term oriented mode that you try to patch things up rather than having complete plan. So that is the system in which companies are trying to be profitable and contribute. And I think some companies, looking at those system limitations and the need for effectively a renewed infrastructure more broadly, it's not just climate, it's biodiversity, it's acidification of the oceans, it's all of that. Right? And they're saying, well, what sort of capabilities would a company need in order to survive and thrive in a world that eventually either transitions or starts working within its boundaries? And we have seen already some of those capabilities. This is what I call trapped capabilities, because these are capabilities that companies develop today They are future fit for a world in which we function within our boundaries, but the current system not fully or even partially recognizes their value. So, for instance, think about pioneering circular economy business models, right? Well, those business models, directly contradict the underlying linearity of the system. In other words, extraction, usage, and waste, and try to redefine, what a business model is by embedding that circularity. But the system is very good at valuing and recognizing linearity, is really bad at looking at circularity because they're saying these are huge costs. I don't even understand why you're making these investments. I am simplifying, but that's an example that kind of tells you the gap between the mind frames, the valuation, and so on of the current system versus companies that are a lot more forward looking and they envision a world in which the economy functions within these boundaries, right? And that, I think, allows us to see the systems level change because ultimately, if you are one of these companies that built these capabilities, there is almost a self-interest, and we're talking about an economic self-interest where you either aggregate with other companies or collaborate or build coalitions with other companies that are doing the same. And then you go argue or advocate for systems level change because the faster systems level change comes, well, the faster the value of your capabilities will be recognized. But most importantly, the faster we're going to get to a world in which the profitable companies, the successful companies, are also the companies that build and maintain capabilities that allow the world to function within, as you mentioned earlier, this idea of aligned capitalism. So the underlying idea is still, if you want to call it that way, capitalistic in the sense that it's economic, right? We're not talking about an entire overhaul of the system. In fact, it's the basic foundation of any economic system. You have to function. You have to maximize whatever it is that you're maximizing, subject to some constraints. And here we have very definitive measurable constraints, and it seems that we are maximizing without considering them, at least not sufficiently, or pricing them not sufficiently explicitly so.
Fantastic. You also mentioned, you spoke of infrastructure and you meant the impact of heat waves or extreme weather on the physical infrastructure, and that it takes time to replace, fix, or make them more adaptive. But also you have written about a different kind of infrastructure. You have written that sustainability built its technical infrastructure, but never its narrative infrastructure. And that truth is a system. Another system here, I think we're talking about another system of standards, records, review, and correction. If truth is a system and sustainability missing that layer, like, is that real? Is the real gap in sustainability underneath everything? Is a trust gap?
I think it's a trust gap in the sense that in the article that you referred to, Ahmed, is when I was, having this reflection about why are we facing this anti-ESG wave? Why didn't we foresee this more? Why have we not been more effective in countering it? And I think one of the things that we should be honest about is that for the last 5 to 7 years, we built what I was calling in that article the technical infrastructure, in the sense that we developed ESG taxonomies and all of the acronyms that we all know and love. And that became an esoteric language between investors, companies, and regulators. There's nothing wrong with developing that infrastructure. Of course, you need to measure things, you need to monitor them, you need to have these taxonomies to make the data comparable and so on and so forth. But I guess my argument there was that in order to build societal level trust, that technical infrastructure, it's a necessary, but it is not a sufficient condition. In other words, we missed that layer, which I call the narrative infrastructure, which is basically translating either corporate action or policy into day-to-day impacts and interactions with the stakeholders that are being affected. And we're talking about employees, workers, communities, indigenous people, and so on and so forth. Because ultimately, if we're saying that, a lot of corporates took these actions in order to have better environmental and social performance, well, what does that mean? It means that if you do it right, you should have had a positive, not just a minimizing the harm, but a positive impact on society and the environment. That evidence-based, data-driven narrative never came together, and therefore this never became what I would call a political economy project. Because ultimately, if you see it as a sustainability movement that tries to change the system, you're not going to do that only through business. You have to do that through the ballot box. You need to have a narrative and show to people how is that affecting their lives in a positive way. For example, green, cleaner, and better jobs, green, cleaner, and better cities, for instance, right? And all the positive impacts that need to come together into a narrative. And that narrative was not there. And therefore, when indeed these folks went to the ballot box and they were especially in the US, then they were faced with a more simplistic narrative that was also not true, right? A narrative of drill, baby, drill, and casting sustainability and ESG as this elitist project top down from above, then clearly there was no trust to build on. Clearly there was no trust to lead people to say, wait a second, that's just not true. My job's improved, my lives improved, and so on and so forth. Then they ended up voting in that direction. So I think that's why if we are to build trust, the technical infrastructure that we mentioned, it's a necessary condition, but we also need a narrative to connect this to a political economy project. And ultimately, that was difficult to do, and it is difficult to do because, as you know, many companies say at least that they avoid being political. They don't want to, enter contested issues. But of course, you and I and everyone knows that, of course, companies are political. Behind closed doors, they speak with regulators. They want to influence laws and regulations. Even in the US, you have the whole industry called lobbying. So it's kind of hiding behind your fingers saying, oh, as companies, we don't want to be political. I mean, you are already political. The question is, will you use that leverage for something good, or would you leverage it only for short-term self-interest, ultimately?
That's great. Thank you so much. So perhaps I would say trust is the infrastructure now, the data-driven, the evidence-based approach. And speaking of that, it takes me to my own world of digital infrastructure now to enable businesses to gain control over their data and build that trust. And trust is a journey. But if we look at a carbon number, it doesn't carry the audit trail a revenue line does. So, or the consequences if it's wrong. So what has to change before a board, looking at the board as the custodian of governance and the C-suite, like the chief executive and CFO, to treat non-finance data like finance data?
Well, first of all, if we're talking about decision making at the board level, especially about non-financial data, we need to make sure that the board has the necessary knowledge, even technical knowledge sometimes, to really understand these numbers, right? What is put in front of the board should be in a very concrete way, decision useful information. In other words, of course, you could put in front of the board all sorts of technical, you mentioned carbon emissions, for instance, but there needs to be another layer that translate that into strategic language. In other words, when we talk about any sort of ESG issue, right, I'm going to assume that the data is verifiable, that the data is robust and well collected and so on. But then someone needs to enter the boardroom and explain the so what. Is it increasing the risk? Is this creating more profits today? Is this likely to unlock opportunities tomorrow? Given the volatility that we see in the world, is managing this particular metric going to make us a more resilient organization? Is this going to prolong our competitiveness or our competitive advantage? So therefore, I would say that at the board level, these numbers, robust and verifiable and comparable as they are, they also need to become essentially strategic knowledge, right? In other words, they need to become sufficiently embedded into the business model language, right? But notice, not in a short run way, right? And this is another problem that boards often have. In other words, they look at numbers that they're short term in orientation and the increased profits today without considering medium to long term impact. So, in other words, it's the data in combination, the data transformed into strategic knowledge and a balance between short term and a long term horizon. And I'm not saying abandon the short term, right? Nobody wakes up one day and say, oh, look at us, we're in the long term today, right? You get to a long term through a series of short terms. The challenge here is that you manage in the short term with a long term orientation. So it's very important to balance the two, not to completely omit short term with long term. I think that's the kind of thinking that the board ought to have these days. And by the way, this applies not only to sustainability issues, right? We're talking about data, verifiable data, and useful data across all of the domains and all of the crises that the world is facing today, whether you want to call it geopolitics, whether you want to call it the disruption caused by AI, and so on and so forth.
What came to manage short-term or long-term orientation that goes to governments?
But definitely. Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, it's a huge topic, but I do think that we do need to start thinking about political institutions that are not so, they're not susceptible to this very, very short-term political cycle, right? We need those changes in government as well. No question.
Yeah. So what needs to change to the board is their knowledge. They need to be more competent. They need to be knowledgeable of sustainability and the impact of non-finance data and the consequences if it goes wrong. So you mentioned the so what. You need to understand the so what and the impact of that. And it should also be embedded in the business model language. That's a great advice. You also, on the other side, speaking of data, we can't speak of data without touching upon AI and the impact of AI on data. And you tend to be most of the time talking about the negative impact, and I come to that. Also, you have documented that AI's other side, like from Google footprint up to 18% in a year, increased by 18%. Data centers demand more than doubling. The demand will double by 2030, and workers and workers in general are on $2 an hour, I think, labeling the worst of the internet. AI might close the data gap, and it also becoming a huge new liability. How does a leader hold both? So let's highlight both sides
Yeah.
in short,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and see how can leaders hold both.
Yeah. So let me start by saying, Ahmed, and you know my views on this. I think AI is an extremely powerful technology. No question. Arguably, probably the most powerful technology we ever had. But I'm a big fan of Daron Acemoglu, the Nobel laureate, and others that basically say that these technologies, they're not inherently good or bad. It's about the governance and the use that we put around them, or whether they end up having a positive or a negative impact. So, of course, there's absolutely huge potential here in the sense that we can use AI as you do, a SustainGRC, to increase the quality, right, reliability, robustness, and comparability of the data that we use. We can achieve enormous efficiencies by using AI. We can solve problems that the human mind cannot solve. We can even, as you know, use AI to work on the world's biggest challenges, like climate change, for instance. But my argument is that we will only do that if the governance and the incentives are in place to do that, right? So there's no question that there is a huge upside if we govern the technology the right way. And already, well, many companies are using AI in that way. I guess I wouldn't call it the negative side. I would actually call it the cautious side. And and my main argument is that, and I don't know how many people would agree with this, but I would say that when a company adopts an AI, usually they look at this through the lens of the adoption of a technology. And I argue that actually a better lens, both in order to manage the risks and in order to leverage the upside of AI adoption, is to look at AI as the adoption of a supply chain. And that's not a bad thing. It only increases the scope through which you need to look at AI. So you shouldn't only look at the AI downstream. In other words, yeah, of course, it's going to increase efficiency, it can increase reliability, it can increase speed. But know, for instance, what new dependencies are you creating? Are your providers? Where are all those models based? How much power concentration is there in the supplier industry? What if, for instance, you lock yourself up with these hugely powerful suppliers and then suddenly they wake up the next morning and say, you know what? I decide to triple the token price and there's nothing you can do about it. Or what if there's a geopolitical risk and then suddenly Trump wakes up and then says, Anthropic, you're no longer allowed to use Fable outside the US. And then suddenly all the companies that had agreements with Fable and Anthropic can no longer use that workflow. Or, for instance, some of these models, right? In the US, there is potential litigation happening about the training models. There is a lot of backlash in terms of the data centers and where they located. I'm not sure if you saw it, but this week, the state of New York became the first state to entirely ban data centers for the whole year. The governor of New York announced that yesterday. So and that's why I said, as a business, of course, you need to integrate it properly into your workflows and reap all the benefits. But do not only look at it as a technology. You have to be fully aware what comes with it and not abandon it, but manage it. Because as always in business, right? What do we want to do? Of course, we want to exploit the upside, but we need to manage the downside risks. Well, you cannot manage the downside risk unless you are aware of them. Right. So it's more of a balanced view. No, I wouldn't call it a negative view because again, this is, because ultimately, if you have huge concentration in, for instance, the supply market, and the benefits that you rip off in the downstream, you might end up paying them on the upstream because you're squeezed on the input costs, on the token price, right? So a business needs to look at both of those. So I'm not, I don't have, a negative judgment on the technology itself and the enormous positive impact it can have. Much more about the human systems around it than the technology itself. And another thing that we should look at. So, for instance, you're also a governance expert. You know what good governance is. Well, a public company that has shares IPO'd but is only controlled by one individual, and the shareholders don't have a say because there's two class of shareholders, and one person can take decisions about the entire company, unaccountable and controlled. That doesn't count as good governance in my book, right? So you may want to work with companies that have good governance and accountability and transparency in place. So it's all more about managing sort of the human systems around AI than AI itself that I typically highlight.
So even AI governance really matters to achieve its potential, but even the system and the ecosystem around it should be also in good shape.
Of course.
I think the cautious side, not the negative side, to ensure benefits outweigh the cost, I think, or in other words, the net positive, the impact of AI should be net positive.
Definitely.
And understand your AI capabilities and the supplying sources, as you mentioned, and you mentioned Claude as the example and the Fable 5. and their concentration risks now. So you should manage that, mitigate that risk. And surprisingly, disappointingly, that the mayor of the mayor of New York didn't watch the game, and he was just issued a ban on New. I thought he was watching the game yesterday. You said he just issued a ban on data centers in New York.
Not the mayor, not the mayor of New York, the governor of the entire state.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, the governor of the entire state of New York, not just the
Oh.
city of New York.
Uh,
For
I thought you were watching the game yesterday.
yeah, I did. And then this was even more disappointing news. But yeah.
All right, fantastic. We have reached almost the end of this great session. And last one, before we conclude, what's the one thing that you would like to leave our audience with?
I think that the short version of it, Ahmed, is that clearly we're going into a world that is a lot more volatile, a lot more uncertain. We've been through 1 or 2 years of a sustainability winter, but I think now we are rebounding in the sense that these issues are still top of mind. I was just reading in the FT today that inflows to ESG funds are again going up after the last 2 years. So I think that the folks should be able to zoom out or tune out rather of all the noise that is happening and the politics and so on, and realize that the world's problems, if anything, they have gotten worse, that building these capabilities, making these investments is for the long term, is unavoidable. And in my humble opinion, it's also the right path to be on. And therefore, tuning out of all this noise, being focused on the medium to long term objectives. Again, it's not just about being focused on sustainability itself. As I mentioned, it's about building better companies, better meaning both more profitable and more impactful. That has not gone away. That will never go away ultimately, right? But just impactful in the sense that we now need to build a system that is viable on this planet.
That's great. I wouldn't agree more. Thank you, Ioannis, so much. You have spent a year naming the pieces, the system level, the narrative gap, truth as a system, the mispricing. To me, this all now is the infrastructure of trust. I think this is the sentence I'm going to use for this session. And to everyone listening today, that's the work. Hold non-finance data to the same rigor as finance data. Thank you for being with us. And thank you so much, Ioannis, for this insightful session.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a great chat. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you.